Since time immemorial, plants and fungi have proven to be one of Homo sapiens' greatest resources, not just as sustenance, but as a fount of healing medicine, spiritual inspiration, and mystery. Humans do not merely utilize these species for these purposes, but are intrinsically involved in the cultural knowledge surrounding them, their domestication, and safekeeping. Imagine a world without painkillers, antibiotics, anticoagulants, anti-malarial medicines, or some chemotherapies, all of which have been either directly derived from, synthesized, or inspired by plants and fungi. And who would want to live in a world without the mystery and magic of poison-tipped arrows or hallucinogens? In Plants of the Gods podcast, renowned ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin, who has worked in and on the Amazon for almost 4 decades studying the relationship between humans and plants, takes his listeners on an inspiring journey from the most remote corners of Amazonia to other exotic locales. Learn about the fascinating history and uses of the plants of knowledge and power, like the hallucinogenic snuffs of the Yanomamo tribe, to coca, from which cocaine is derived, the ayahuasca liana, from which a hallucinogenic brew is produced, or the diverse formulations of curare, a plant mixture which relaxes the muscles of the body and leads to asphyxiation. Not only will you better understand what we know about these sacred species and how we use them, but how they are revolutionizing Western medicine while the fight is on to protect these healing species and the people who know them best. This and more from Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.
Hi, this is Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin of the Amazon Conservation Team, here with the Plants of the Gods podcast. Last week we talked about ayahuasca, the wine of the soul. Today I want to talk about snuffs, and I want to be clear what a snuff is. A snuff is a solid substance which is typically ground down and inhaled through the nose. So if it's a smoke you're taking in, that's a sniff. But if it's a solid powder, it's a snuff. And today I want to talk about the 2 potent hallucinogenic snuffs, the 2 powerful entheogenic snuffs of the northern Amazon. And they are made from a forest tree, Virola. It's known as Nyaquana to the Yanomami. The other is known as Hisiomi. It is made from the seeds of a leguminous tree, genus Adenanthera. These are very powerful mind-altering substances which allow one to reach similar altered states, which really haven't had the attention that ayahuasca has received. Ayahuasca has even been satirized in The Onion. That's how much of a global phenomenon it's become. Now, I'm an ethnobotanist by training. An ethnobotanist is very simply a scientist who studies the relationship between people and plants. So you could say ethnobotany is searching for medicinal or hallucinogenic plants in the Amazon jungle, and you could say that ethnobotany is studying farmers growing corn in Iowa. I chose to do the former rather than the latter. And these snuffs, and there's 2 snuffs really, they're known most commonly as yopo. But in my investigations and the research of other people before and after me, it's become very clear that these yopo snuffs are basically made from 2 very different plants. And I will describe them in a bit of detail today to give you the botanical and the ethnobotanical background. But my favorite quote about these snuffs comes from the great ethnobotanist Richard Schultes, who said that unlike the Colombian Indians, among whom the snuff is usually restricted to shamans, these tribes, that is the Yanomami, often take the drug in daily life. All male members of the group above the age of 13 or 14 may participate. The hallucinogen is often snuffed in frighteningly excessive amounts. Now, when I first got to the Yanomami in the mid-'80s, and I saw them taking the snuff, they would take these very long tubes, which they call mocohiros, and stick the tubes in their nostrils, and then the shaman would blow in a huge amount of snuff. And the recipient of the snuff would immediately cradle his skull and rock back and forth, obviously in great pain. And when I turned to my Yanomamo guide and said, well, that looks awful, he said, well, if you take the snuff, and I recommend that you do, he says, you will feel terrible, and then you will feel wonderful. Now, in the white man's world, you drink aguardiente, and you feel wonderful, and then you feel terrible. So who's smarter? Also worth looking at the parallel to taking other mind-altering substances, particularly LSD, for example. When you take LSD, you have these hallucinations, you have these visions, you enter these trance states, and then at the end of it, you enter what's known as the black period. Everything is very dark and negative. In fact, that's the source of the Rolling Stones song, Painted Black. So when you take the Yanomami snuff, it does hurt on the way in, but afterwards, after all the visions, you feel terrific. You feel omniscient. You feel all-powerful. So this is something that I had never experienced before with these mind-altering substances, and it's something that makes these plants of the gods very, very special. Now, you might wonder, why would people take a snuff in the first place? That's not a common way of taking entheogenic substances. For example, if you're taking the magic mushrooms, and we'll talk about them in a later episode, you eat them. Or as we talked about in the previous episode, ayahuasca, you drink it. Some people even take enemas of mind-altering substances, and tobacco has been administered that way. And we'll be talking about tobacco in a later sequence. But snuffs are taken for the following reasons, and that is that the nasal passages are full of capillaries. So that means that the compounds in the plants, or the fungi, or the frogs, whatever you're taking, go into the brain, into the bloodstream very, very quickly. So that is one of the reasons that hallucinogenic snuffs are so dramatic in their effects on the patient, on the taker. And this is, again, one of the interesting aspects of these entheogenic compounds, be they plants, be they fungi, be they frogs, is that the shaman, the medicine man or medicine woman, take the substance with you. I mean, imagine going to the doctor and he says, well, you have an infection here, let's both take antibiotics. It doesn't happen. But part of the reasons that these medicine women and men can sometimes cure things that our own physicians, our own herbalists cannot, is because they're entering these altered states with you. Now, the first of the two snuffs taken by the Yanomami, which they call Nyackwana, is made from Varrola. Varrola is a very large and very beautiful tree, common in the Amazon rainforest. It's essentially an Amazon nutmeg. It's a member of the nutmeg family, Myristicaceae. And one of the most interesting things about this family, and about nutmeg in particular, nutmeg is the only tree, nutmeg is native to the rainforests of Southeast Asia, nutmeg is the only tree that produces two separate spices. Nutmeg from the seed and mace from the aril, the seed coat. So that's kind of an interesting botanical aside. And the reason that nutmeg is germane to this discussion and this podcast is if you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, when he was in prison, they would sneak into the prison commissary, the prison kitchen at night, and take nutmeg and snort it because it was a mind-altering substance. So it shouldn't be any surprise that the Amazonian nutmeg, of which there's about 60 species of the genus Varrola, about 4 or 5 of them are known to contain hallucinogenic principles. Now, the methods of preparation are particularly interesting because they're very different. Amongst some of the hunter-gatherer tribes, the Macu and I believe the Nukak in the Colombian Amazon, they get the resin from the inside of the bark and they just drink it. Amongst the Huitotos, a very large tribe in the Colombian Amazon, they take the resin and they dry it and they kind of mush it together to make pellets, which they eat. But the most common and the most powerful way of taking the snuff, ranging from Colombia to the Venezuelan Amazon, is to make a powder out of this bark resin. Now, the first person to come into contact with these trees, these Varrola trees in the Amazon, was the great British explorer Richard Spruce, who explored the Amazon and the Andes for 14 years in the middle of the 19th century. And interestingly enough, it was his book, Notes of a Botanist on the Amazon and the Andes, which was the inspiration for Richard Schultes, who had the same initials, R-E-S, who followed in Spruce's footsteps essentially a century later. Schultes was sick as a child, and so that he would continue his education because he was bedridden for months. His father went to the public library in East Boston, it's still there, and got him Spruce's book. And there was little Richard in his sickbed reading about ayahuasca at the age of 9 and 10. I can assure you he was the only kid in Boston reading about ayahuasca at that young and very impressionable age. The next time that Western science comes into contact with Varroa is about 50 years after Spruce, and this is the great German ethnographer Koch Grunberg, who found it amongst the Yakwana peoples. Now, the Yakwana are a Carib language group. There are about 4 language groups in the Amazon, Carib being the predominant one in the northeast Amazon, the Yakwanas in Venezuela, also known as the Maquiritaris, who are the best indigenous boatmen in the whole Amazon basin, the Waiwai in southern Guyana, the Trios and Guayanas on the Suriname, Brazil, French Guiana border. And these are the only Carib-speaking group members, the Yakwana, who take this hallucinogen from this Amazonian nutmeg. And Koch Grunberg reported on it. Interestingly, Spruce, who worked with Varrolas from a botanical perspective, spent many years in the area, never noted that this was used for hallucinogenic purposes, unlike his discovery. And of course, when ethnobotanists discover things, it's because the Indians told them what they were doing with it. That Spruce discovered ayahuasca, but he didn't discover Varrola. Of course, if you want to look at it in detailed terms, the discoverers were, of course, the Amerindian peoples, the indigenous peoples themselves. The next report of Varrola snuff was that of Adolfo Duque, a great Brazilian botanist, not an ethnobotanist, who said in 1939 that the Indians were making a hallucinogen from Varrola, which they were, but he said they were making it from the leaves, which they weren't. So he got it half right. Finally, in 1951, it was Schultes himself who made the first scientific discovery of this, who noted it in use amongst many tribes of the Northwest Amazon, and said that they used this plant for disease treatment, for prophecy, for divination, and particularly for treatment of fungal infections. Now, fungal infections are a common problem in the humid tropics. If you can't cure fungal infections and you're living in the Amazon rainforest, you are a fungal infection. Western medicine has a lot of difficulty curing deep fungal infections. And the point here is that something that may be a hallucinogen in one culture may be a different type of medicine in another. Something that may be a poison in one culture may be a medicine in another. The father of toxicology, Paracelsus, in Europe 400 or 500 years ago said the dose makes the poison. The point here being that something in poisonous in great dosages may be therapeutic in smaller doses. And you have to look no further than your own medicine cabinet, because 2 aspirin will cure your headache, 100 aspirin will kill you. Now, the greatest users of this Varrola snuff to make these divination and these prophecies possible are the Yanomami, the Yanomamo, also known as the Waika, also known as the Shirishana. This is one of the largest extant tribes in Amazonia. They live on both sides of the Venezuela-Brazil border, and it is their remoteness which has essentially protected them up until recently, when they've suffered invasions from gold miners in particular, more so on the Brazil side, but now we're seeing it on the Venezuela side with the terrible economic situation there. And this was the hallucinogen, the Varrola-based hallucinogen prepared by the Yanomami, which Schulte said they snuff in frighteningly large amounts. Now I want to read you a little bit about what it was like to participate in a ceremony with the Yanomami. And this is from my diary in 1987. The roundhouse was a large circular dwelling about half the size of a football field. At its center, in an open area called the Central Plaza, the roof was cut away to reveal the sky. There, a young Yanomamo Indian lay on the ground, naked except for a string around his waist. The man had been bewitched by a shaman from a neighboring village, we were told. A middle-aged man, whose torso was painted with black serpentine lines, ran feverishly back and forth, swinging a machete and chanting at the top of his lungs. He was the local shaman, working to rid the young boy of the evil spirits that possessed him. On the sidelines, about 10 women of the tribe, dressed in red cotton waistbands and black seed necklaces, watched the ritual in silence. All around the dwelling, men sat in hammocks, watching the proceedings, carving arrowheads in silence, or exchanging comments about the unfortunate boy. Children played in the dirt, oblivious to the ritual taking place. Periodically during the ceremony, a tribesman holding a hollow bamboo tube about a foot long sprinkled some reddish-gray powder into one end of the tube, then blew it forcefully up the shaman's nose. Now, my mentor Schultes was often asked, what's the difference between an anthropologist and an ethnobotanist? And he would always smile and say, participatory science. When the shaman leans forward and passes you the cup of ayahuasca or the mokohiro filled with hallucinogenic snuff, the anthropologist says, no, I can't do that. I'll lose my objectivity and won't be able to take notes. Whereas the ethnobotanist leans forward and says, yeehaw. So let me tell you a bit more of my visit to the Yanomami. We sat down at the edge of the central plaza. The shaman pointed the mokohiro at my nose and made motions of blowing snuff up my nostrils. I smiled and pantomimed receiving it. He said something to one of the men standing behind us, who then reached up for a little bag hanging from the rafters. Suddenly things were happening a bit faster than I'd planned. Yopo, said the pilot, calling the snuff powder by its Spanish name. The man passed the bag to the shaman, who then dumped the reddish-gray powder onto a banana leaf that had been placed on the ground between us. Now you've done it, said my pilot, who looked as uncomfortable as I felt. I tried to tell the shaman, I'd like to try the snuff, but not until tomorrow. But he spoke no Spanish. He just smiled and began loading the pipe. I looked desperately for my Yanomamo interpreter to translate my message, but he'd melted into a crowd of Indians at the far end of the roundhouse. When I turned back to the shaman, he was pointing the tube at me. With equal parts anxiety, excitement, fear, and anticipation, I placed the tube's bowl in my right nostril. The shaman held the other end between his lips and blew, starting slowly and finishing with a mighty blast. The force of the blast blew me backwards from my squatting position. Immediately a warm sensation flooded me, my nostril, my sinus, my head, my limbs. They were all aflame. I picked myself up and the pain began to register. The crown of my head began to throb as if I'd been hit with a war club. My vision blurred and I was overcome by dizziness. I struggled to breathe as both my throat and nose filled with a mucus-like discharge. In the midst of my discomfort and confusion, I looked over and saw the shaman refilling the tube. He pointed at me again and gently eased the palm nut at the end of the tube into my left nostril. My first inclination was to refuse, but before I could gather my wits to speak, the shaman let go another powerful blast. The force seemed to propel the drug from the shaman's tube directly into my bloodstream and into my very soul. Although my heart pounded painfully in my chest, a subtle sense of exhilaration accompanied the pain that racked my body. At the edge of my field of vision, tiny figures began to appear. My nose started to run, but my vision cleared a bit. I saw Indians in other parts of the roundhouse point at me and break into enormous grins. Some of them stopped what they were doing, chatting to each other in their hammocks, carving arrow points for the hunt, making their own batch of snuff. They sat in a circle with me at the center. I felt a warm bond of brotherhood with them. As the snuff coursed through my body, the Indians spoke their native language, which I now seemed to understand. One of them patted me on the back as another stroked my arm. Overwhelmed by this sense of belonging, I pointed to the abena on the banana leaf in front of me. More, I said to the shaman, although it sounded as if someone else's voice was speaking. The shaman loaded the pipe and blew the abena in my right nostril. He refilled it and blew it into the left. I sensed he was giving me subnormal doses and blowing the stuff much more gently than the Indians did among themselves. Even so, I was beginning to hallucinate wildly. More, I said. I wanted the full experience. By now, my senses had been severely altered. My hearing was especially acute. I felt as if I could hear everything in the Chagnon. My field of vision had been greatly expanded. It was as if I was looking at the world through a wide-angle lens. At the edge of my field of vision, the little figures began to dance. The shaman raised the snuff pipe again, and I took several more blasts, each larger and harder than the one before. The final blast knocked me backwards, and I lay flat on my back. My throat was burning. The top of my head felt it would explode. I cradled my head in my hands. The story goes on from there. But when I asked the Yanomami people why I saw those little figures, first at the edge of my vision, then they began to dance, then they began to meld with me. I can't put it any other way. They said, those are the Hikora. Those are the spirits of the forest. They live in the trees. And when you take a pena, when you take Nayakwana, they come down from the trees and they enter your chest and they give you protection. And if you're a shaman, which you're not, they work with you to heal. Now, if you study the science and art of shamanism, we hear about totemic spirits. We hear about the shaman who turned himself into a jaguar. We hear about the medicine man of the plains of the Lakota people who was possessed by the spirit of the buffalo. So this idea of nature spirits, whether they're little men living in the trees, or whether they're the spirits of the animals, or whether it's the medicine man or medicine woman turning into a jaguar and roaming the jungle at night, or becoming a harpy eagle and flying over the jungle in search of new medicinal plants to heal their people. This is part of the shamanic tradition. The point being that if you're a shaman, it empowers you in a certain way beyond that of mere mortals like ourselves. But what these plants and animals and fungi can do is give you a window into these alternate realities that is really a part of the world of shamanism. Now, in taking this snuff with the Yanomami, to me, it was, in a sense, a fulfillment of a career dream because my mentor had worked in the Colombian Amazon for 15 years and moved as far east as the Yanomami, which is southern Venezuela and adjacent Brazil. I had worked in Suriname and a bit to the west in Guyana. So to be able to work with the people that he had done his final field work with sort of felt like a joining of forces. And what the Yanomami showed me after taking the Nayakwana, after taking the Yopo, after taking the Varrola snuff, was that they had another plant that they used, and that they called Hisiomi. And Hisiomi is an equally interesting, and possibly even in some ways more interesting, magical plant of the indigenous peoples of the New World. Because the first report of hallucinogenic snuff from the New World was in 1496. And this is 4 years after Columbus's first voyage. This is amongst the Taíno peoples, who are now extinct, on the island of Hispaniola, which we now know as Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it was said that this snuff in particular was such an important part of their lives that it was not only traded from the Caribbean to the mainland, South America, but as far as the Andes. And we have found snuff bundles, thousands of years old, in the Andes, in northwestern Argentina, in Bolivia. And the question is how far these things travel and where they go from. The ethnobotanical thinking is that this tree, Anadenanthera peregrina, is actually native to the savannas of the northern Amazon, what we know as the Llanos in Venezuela, and that this was traded as far as the Caribbean in pre-Columbian times and traded as far south as the Andes in pre-Columbian times because it was so popular, so important, such an excellent tool to access these spirit worlds, both for the shaman and for the patient. Some used it as a daily stimulant. It was like your morning coffee. There was, of course, no coffee in pre-Columbian Americas. The coffee is native to the highlands of Ethiopia. And there is a great quote from De las Casas in 1500. He was a missionary sent to tropical America who was very sympathetic to the indigenous cause, who was totally appalled at the way the Spaniards were mistreating, abusing, terrorizing, even killing these indigenous peoples. And he wrote something which resonates today. Casas wrote, "The Indians sucked up the powder and sniffed it up the nose, receiving that amount of it they had determined to take. The powder thus snuffed went into their brains, almost as if it had been drinking strong wine. In this manner, the Indians become intoxicated or almost intoxicated. The power, the ceremonies, the procedure they call cohoba in their language. This intoxication caused them to babble confusedly or talk like the Germans. Anybody who struggled through introductory German as a freshman in college can, I think, empathize with that quote. But here's another quote from a couple hundred years later from Gumilla, who was a Jesuit missionary working on the Orinoco. And much of the story of Adenanthera, Hissiomi, is centered on the Orinoco, because the Orinoco was first explored scientifically by Alexander von Humboldt. There's a great deal of von Humboldt's journey detailed in my most recent book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. And he found a group of Otomac Indians, that is Gumilla the missionary, and he said they use it as a stimulant. They use it to prepare for battle. He said before going into battle, they would throw themselves into a total frenzy with the snuff, wound themselves, and full of rage go forth to battle like rabid jaguars. So von Humboldt, when he reported on it, was working with indigenous peoples of the central Orinoco, and they were being missionized by the church so successfully they don't even exist anymore. But it wasn't until Richard Spruce, that same Richard Spruce, went to the Orinoco 50 years after von Humboldt, in about 1851, that he was able to do the botanical identification of this Hissiomi adenanthera. And this was tested. It was sent back to the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew in the 1850s, and there Schultes found it in the collection in 1977, and he tested it. And what he found was that the major component was bufotenin. Bufotenin is a powerful hallucinogenic alkaloid. Bufotenin is found in 3 places in the natural world. One in frogs, hence the name, another in fungi, another in angiosperms, that is flowering plants. Now this is interesting for a variety of reasons, because bufotenin is related to psilocin and psilocybin, which of course is the famous component extracted from the magic mushrooms, and it was extracted from the magic mushrooms collected by Schultes in Oaxaca in the 30s, and the extraction was done by a fellow whose name will be familiar to many of the listeners, Albert Hofmann. Hofmann was the chemist who extracted these compounds, elucidated the chemical structure, and published it. So here you have something from a mushroom in Mexico, which is then found in a tree in the savannas of Venezuela, and also exists in frogs. And here's why that's interesting. In a later episode, we'll talk about the magic frog, the green monkey toad, the green monkey frog of the Northwest Amazon, now being used for hallucinogenic purposes, entheogenic purposes, not only by peoples in the Northwest Amazon, but becoming popular in other parts of the world, very similar to ayahuasca. It also has a completely novel painkiller, non-addictive painkiller in it. It's also being used to dope racing horses, because they test racing horses to make sure they haven't been doped with amphetamines, but this is a completely different class of chemical compounds. So you never know where Amazonian chemical compounds will show up in the world these days, and that is a conversation we'll be delving into in the future. But the other thing that makes Adenanthera interesting is there's another species, Adenanthera colubrina, which has a rather different distribution and was used as a snuff in other parts of South America, including by the Incas themselves. Now, we know very little about Inca ethnobotany, but we do know that they used this other species of Hissiomi, this other species of Adenanthera, as a snuff, and they called it Vilca. And one of their most famous cities is Vilcabamba, which is the plain where Vilca grows in the Quechua language. So what is particularly interesting right now is not only that we're seeing these magical plants, these entheogenic plants and fungi and frogs being used therapeutically, not just in shamanic societies, but increasingly around the world. But that these ancient finds and old collections, whether it's spruce collected in the 1850s or these bundles being found in Andean caves from 2,000 and I believe 4,000 years ago, we're able to use modern technology to analyze what it's consisted of. And let me tell you why this has broader applications. There really was a King Midas, and he ruled over what is now part of Turkey. And his tomb was excavated in the 1950s. The stuff was brought back to the University Museum at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And a few years ago, an extraordinary scientist by the name of Patrick McGovern said, let me take these new analytical tools and see if I can find out what they served at King Midas's last feast, because there were bowls that had been buried with King Midas. And he was able to scrape the stuff from the bottom and find out exactly what they're eating and what proportions, what kind of wine they were drinking, and he was actually able to recreate it. So the point here is that these new tools of technology can help us unlock the secrets of the past, to find out what people were using in the somewhat distant past, like in the case of Spruce and his hallucinogens collected 150 years ago, and even in other cases with these ancient wine vessels, in some instances going back 7,000 and 8,000 years. The problem is that these shamanic cultures and their plants and their animals are disappearing. First and foremost, we see the rainforest disappearing faster than ever. We see the Amazon fires out of control. We see COVID pressing in on the indigenous peoples of the world, and not just indigenous peoples in the Amazon, but here in North America as well. And we're looking at the possibility of an ethnobiological holocaust, because we're not only losing the species, we're losing the knowledge. As indigenous peoples see the lure of the outside world, as modernity is pressing in, as gold miners run in and pollute their rivers, as narco traffickers run in and chase the people out, set their longhouses on fire, they're on the run. And the great irony here is that as we have a newfold appreciation for the value of these plants and these other products, the plants, the fungi, the animals are disappearing. Just look at the case of the frogs. Frogs are disappearing all over the world. There's a chytrid fungus infecting these frogs. We never knew before that frogs were hallucinogenic and had other therapeutic principles, which I'll be talking about later. But frogs are disappearing. So the candle is burning on both ends. On one hand, we have a newfound appreciation for the value of Mother Nature and the indigenous wisdom that teaches us how to use it. On the other hand, we're destroying it faster than we can learn it. So the question is, are we going to save this in time? Are we going to save these snuffs and use them to heal our illnesses, which cannot be cured by Western medicine, in time? Can we protect these people and give these cultures room to survive in an ever homogenizing world? Or are we going to continue to foul our own nest with deforestation, with pollution of the oceans, with climate change, with pandemics? COVID-19 is not the end of the story. There's many more viruses and microbes waiting to prey on us. So better stewardship of nature is one of the best ways to keep these things at bay. Better stewardship of nature is one of the best ways to find new preventatives and new treatments and possibly even new cures to live well and successfully and better steward ourselves and the planet on which we live. Let me end on a sad note. Theodor Koch-Grünberg was a German ethnographer. He did some of the greatest work ever done in Amazonia. He loved the indigenous peoples dearly and was able to collect information from tribes that no longer exist. That's how important his work was. But towards the end of his career, he was saddened by the changes taking place. And this is well over 100 years ago that these changes were already set well in motion. So let me read one of the saddest quotes of anything he ever wrote. After the rubber boom had swept into the Northwest Amazon, "Hardly 5 years have gone by since my last visit. Whoever comes here now will no longer find the pleasant place I once knew. The pestilential stench of a pseudo-civilization has fallen on the brown people who have no rights. Like a swarm of annihilating grasshoppers, the inhuman gang of rubber barons continues to press forward. The Colombians have already settled at the mouth of the Cuduyari River, and they carry off my friends to the death-dealing rubber forests. Raw brutality, mistreatment, and murder are the order of the day. The Indian villages are desolate, their homes have been reduced to ashes, and their gardens, deprived of hands to care for them, are taken over by the jungle. Lucky are those who died before.
This has been Plants of the Gods, Healing, Culture, and Conservation with Dr. Mark Plotkin. Stay tuned for more stories about shamans, hallucinogens, entheogens, unique religious and cultural histories, and rainforest adventures and cures. If you enjoyed this episode, please recommend us to your friends and rate and review on iTunes. To learn more about the mystery and splendor of the Amazon rainforest, find Dr. Plotkin's latest book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, on Amazon.com or your local bookstore. To learn more about the Amazon Conservation Team's efforts to protect these plants of power and wisdom, visit amazonteam.org. Thanks for listening to Plants of the Gods with Dr. Mark Plotkin.